Our text for this evening is Luke 22, verses 14 through 30. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. And he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, Take this and divide it amongst you. For I tell you, I will not drink it again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who has betrayed him. They began to question among themselves which of them it might be who did this. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered the greatest. Jesus said to them, The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials. I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table, in my kingdom, and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. There was no peace around my grandmother's dinner table. Some families gathered each week around the matriarch's table to exchange pleasantries, share good food, and good conversation. My family was a little different. We all gathered around the table. Our immediate family was churched each week and sometimes came dressed in our polyester suits. My uncle came attired as a Hell's Angel in a state of consciousness which was sometimes suspect. My other uncle would be there, the baby of the family, jumping down the stairs, taking very little of life seriously as he was still in high school. My grandfather would pass the chili, showing his South Sea tattoo purchased at some point during World War II. To say that there was a variance of opinion around the table would be an understatement. The subjects would turn to either politics or religion, or, heaven forbid, both. Someone would pile the chili powder into their bowl as the heat in the conversation also rose. Voices became easier to hear, and yelling usually ensued, and someone might storm out, to be found later under a car tinkering with something that needed to be adjusted. You might think everyone hated each other with the language and tempers that flared every single week. Yet each week, everyone there returned. They returned to the table, warts, opinions, and all. So who do you invite to your dinner table? We are sometimes picky about who sits at our table and joins us for dinner. Even in Jesus' time, the seating was usually reserved for the family, especially at Passover. Jesus chose who would celebrate Passover with him. They would be his surrogate family for the night, an honor to be sure. You might be surprised at who Jesus had at table with him. It probably did not look like your family, but the scene doesn't surprise me because it probably did look a little bit more like my family. Jesus' table guests probably did look a tad bit more like my family than yours. So this evening, I want you to look around the table. You and I have known since chapter 6 in Luke that Uncle Judas would betray Jesus. Yet there he was, seated at the table. No one else knew, but the reader knew and Jesus knew. Judas was strangely quiet that night. Usually he was the one who brought the political rhetoric to the table along with the other spices, but not tonight. Peter would betray Jesus. Now, you and I, we suspected back in chapter 9, when Peter had problems with the suffering component of the kingdom of God, that there might be something wrong. And I am sure that by this point in the gospel, Jesus knew exactly what Peter was made of and what he probably would do, almost certainly would do, when problems struck. And yet, there he was at the table. And then it began. Now, in most families, it is this discussion of who is mom's favorite, a discussion which rarely ever happens when mom is present. But here, on that Thursday night, it was about who Jesus liked best. Luke doesn't name names, but the squabbling began. And soon the dinner table degenerated into loud voices and incriminations and a lot of posturing, or at least that's how I imagine it. Because that's what my family would have done. It might be good to remember that just because those gentlemen were seated around the table, Jesus was clear in chapter 13 of Luke that being at the table doesn't automatically get you into heaven. The funny thing is, Luke looked around the table and holds them all to blame. All to blame for exactly the same thing. Judas's actual betrayal is placed on the same level as the disciples squabbling over who is most important. Luke seemed to believe that my church-going family in suits, shall we say, was as responsible for the conversation at my grandmother's dinner table as my biker dude uncle. Quite honestly, I don't think that's fair. Yet there it is. Judas is guilty of the same thing that the disciples are. They're all in the same boat. And I just don't think that's fair. But it doesn't matter, does it? Because Jesus and Luke saw it exactly that way. So Jesus settled in. Not only did he settle into dinner, but he settled it right then and there. I think he settled the squabbling at the table like my grandfather would sometimes settle it. Now you have to understand that my grandfather fought the Japanese in World War II. And I'm here to tell you that there wasn't much around that dinner table that scared him. That had already happened. And when he spoke, you listened, and it ended. And your behavior changed. You listened. And I think the same was true at Jesus' table. You listened. Jesus was about to go to the cross. And my friends, there wasn't much around that table that scared him. So he just settled it. Once again, he warned the disciples about their pride. That was what they were all guilty of, wasn't it? You must, he says, you must become like a little child. For the last time, he said, for the last time, he emphasized, if there was anything that he was afraid of, is that they were not listening to him. So you and I, tonight, we need to listen. as though it were the last time. You have to serve each other, he said. Let go of the politics and the position. You need to listen to him. It's not the last meal that I would have wanted with my family. Yet it was the last meal Jesus would have with his disciples. But you know, the funny thing is, life is sometimes like that. That's the last meal that you get. And I understand that. I get it. You might think that I might not miss the Saturday or Sunday meals at my grandparents' house. That somehow I would not miss the yelling and the hollering and the fighting, and you would be right about that. You might think that there was no way we could have possibly loved each other given the depth of misunderstanding we consistently demonstrated week after week after week without fail around that table. But you would be wrong. You would be wrong. You see, I would give anything to have one more meal with members of my family that are no longer here, despite all of its imperfections. And you know something? I think Jesus felt the same. He knew. He knew that this was his last meal. No one else knew. No one else around the table had figured it out, close as the event was. But Jesus knew. And he loved them. And somehow I get that. I get that. Jesus' family for the evening was, how should we say this? They were a disparate group. That's probably a polite way of saying it. And some of you understand what it's like to have a family meal like that, with such a different array of characters around the table. And this is what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that you don't love them. You know that perhaps they are more than they are at any given mealtime when they squabble and fight. And I think Jesus knew that they were more than they were at that moment around that table on that night. And I think that you know that your family will be more than that at some point in the future. And I think Jesus knew the same thing. Because they're family. They were his family. Because he chose them. So Jesus named them apostles. That's what he called them that night. I think for the first time, but maybe not. He called them apostles because he knew that when he was gone, they would run the house. They would be the heirs. Those 12 men would become the head of the family. So they must know. They have to be known. And he, Jesus, would tell them, this is my body, and this is my blood. We have heard most of this before. how Jesus took bread and he blessed it and he gave thanks and broke it and gave it to his disciples. We've seen this before. We saw all this before when Jesus fed the crowds. It all looked so vaguely familiar. But tonight the explanation of it all was different. This is my body. And this is my blood. This was new. Jesus took the ancient words and he changed them. He changed them. He, Jesus, would suffer and sacrifice himself. Jesus would be their next of kin. Jesus would be their Redeemer. This was their Father's house. And Jesus would keep them safe even if it meant suffering and dying. So let me explain, if I can, with another reference to my family. See, every week my grandmother would serve us dinner. Sometimes on Saturday, sometimes on Sunday, sometimes it was lunch, and sometimes it was supper. One never knew, depending on what the schedule said. But no matter who showed up, no matter how many showed up, no matter what the dinner conversation was, no matter what day it was, my grandmother would fix the meal. That was, in the Old Testament sense, my father's house. It is the place, the family homestead. Literally my grandparents' house. And my grandparents were considered, in an Old Testament sense, our next of kin. And it was their responsibility. Their responsibility because they loved us. It was their covenant. It was their promise. So when my Uncle Dwayne couldn't keep a roof over his head, they put him up until he could. When my aunt and uncle were saving money to buy a house, they gave them a room and board. When my dad, who couldn't measure or cut a straight line to save his soul, needed to hang drywall, my grandfather dropped everything he was doing and showed up with his remarkably straight tape measure and plumb line and helped hang the drywall so it got done right. And in a rare move, my grandmother showed up with lunch. We were part of my grandparents' house. They were our next of kin. And they loved us. And they would do anything for us. And every week they put out a spread because it was their obligation. And they loved to fulfill it. They wanted us there. They wanted us there for dinner more than anything else. No matter what it sounded like to an outsider, no matter what the squabbles and the yelling and the hollering, whatever it may have sounded like to somebody on the outside, it was their house and their family. And I would give anything to do it all again. So when Jesus turns to his family, to the apostles, and he says, I have wanted to have this meal with you more than anything, I get it. I get it. I understand why he would do anything for us. And I understand that he has done everything for us. And we are his family. He is our next of kin. And he has redeemed us and gathered us around his table. This is my body. This is my blood.